Well, first of all, I want to say good morning to each and every one of you. I'm going to just sort of get a little bit more comfortable before we actually begin. I've been in dialogue with a number of Muslims, and one is surrounding what the Bible actually teaches about Jesus. And out of that came a discussion on did Jesus ever claim deity for himself? Now, I think it's quite evident that on many occasions that Jesus did claim deity for himself. Now, what I want to do here is look at the Gospel of John, and when we look at the Gospel of John, we have to keep in mind why was the Gospel of John written, and we find and I'm just going to read this for you, and excuse me, I have a rather severe visual impairment, but I do want to read this in your hearing. In John chapter 20, in verses 30 and 31, John is beginning to conclude his gospel with this statement. Now Jesus did many other things in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so when we look at any book that is written, whether it's something like the Bible or the Quran or any secular book, the writer has a purpose in why he's written the book. I mean, that's essential to the understanding of anything. Is why was, we have to ask ourselves, why was a book written? And when we come to the reading the New Testament and reading or any book of the Bible, I try to tell people to help in their understanding is what was the writer's intent, what was the writer trying to communicate, and what would the original hearers have understood. And it does become difficult, especially when you're dealing with ancient literature, is that we're living in the 21st century, and if something is written in the 1st century or the 7th century, there is a cultural gap, and there's also a time gap. But John is right here is telling us why he's writing. He says, I'm writing that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so we know what the purpose of the gospel is. Well, in understanding John, I think it's also important that we look at the prologue of John. And I know that some may say that these are not the words of Jesus per se, and I agree, these are not the words of Jesus before they are the words of the writer. And but the prologue, you can't really understand the Gospel of John without the prologue. The prologue, I think, is absolutely essential and sets up the rest of the narrative in the Gospel. And the prologue consists of 18 verses. I'm just going to read 4 verses, or we're going to read verses 1 through 3, and then verse 14. And again, excuse me if I lose a little bit of eye contact with you, but here we go. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, that is the Word, was in the beginning with God. All things, not most things, not some things, it says all things were made through him, that is the Word, and without him, that is the Word, not anything was made that was made. So we see that here that the Word, in the beginning was the Word. And it's interesting, this little word was is in the imperfect tense. In other words, no matter how far back you put the beginning, the Word was already in existence. And we see that that the Word was with God. And again, in the Greek, it's pros ton theon. And again, this is in the imperfect tense, that he was existing with God before the beginning of time. And then it makes a statement that this word was God. Now, he's not the Father, but that he is separate from the Father, and yet he is of the same essence of or the Father and him share the same essence. And then verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the only Son, or the only begotten, from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so at a point in time, the Word becomes flesh. And again, when you read the prologue, you begin to understand exactly what is, if we can really understand something like, something of this magnitude. But we begin to see that the writer of the gospel, the Apostle John, is going to begin to tell us who Jesus is. Well, we often get the questions, and this is where I want to go, basically looking at a few verses in John chapter 17. Now, Muslims like to focus in on verse 3. I'm going to read that for you, and then we'll back up and look at what is actually happening here. In verse 3, and this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. Now, I acknowledge there are two persons here. Two persons. I acknowledge that. And they will argue that, well, if the Father is the only true God, how can Jesus be God? And they try to separate the two. So let's look at, let's start back in chapter 17 and verse 1, and we can see exactly what is happening. And this is basically the upper room discourse. Jesus is giving his final instructions to his disciples before he leaves the world and goes on to is crucified and ascends on to heaven. But so let's just begin at first verse. I'm going to make verse 1. I'm going to make comments after I read each verse, and we can see whether or not Jesus is beginning to claim deity for himself. And when Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and he said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you. Well, first of all, we have God the Son addressing God the Father as his Father. And so Jesus is actually addressing God as his Father. I often wonder why Muslims who tell us that Jesus is not the Son of God constantly, why they would come here when Jesus is addressing God as his Father. I really don't understand that. But let's look at these. And what is Jesus demanding? Jesus is demanding that glory from God. I mean, is any person worthy on the face of this earth, be he Muslim, Christian, Hindu, whatever, any man, to demand that God would glorify him? I wouldn't think so. I mean, to demand glory from God is to is this beyond comprehension how anyone can actually, do this. Now, verse 2, since you have given him authority over all flesh. And so Jesus is claiming to have authority over all flesh. So my question to my Muslim friend is, did Muhammad come in the flesh? If Jesus has authority over all flesh, then Jesus must have authority over Muhammad. And Jesus has the authority to grant eternal life to all whom the Father has given him. So if Jesus has authority to grant eternal life, what prophet has authority to grant eternal life to anybody? To grant eternal life to anybody, that is the prerogative of God. And then we can look at John 3, and this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you've sent. In John chapter 5, Jesus Christ, or I'm sorry, 1 John chapter 5, the Epistle of John, and most scholars agree that the Gospel of John and 1 John were written by the same individual. Jesus Christ is called the only true God. And this is in context of basically that to all the false gods that were out there, that there's only one true God. And I acknowledge that. But it's a statement of comparison that the other deities, the pagan deities that were at existence at that time, were not true. But we have the only true God, as in that is proclaimed in the Gospels. Verse 4: I have glorified you on the earth, having accomplished the work which you gave me to do. And now verse 5: and now, Father, glorify me. Again, Jesus is demanding that the Father glorify him with me in your own presence. All right, so let's go on. With the glory that I had with you before the world existed. I would like to ask my Muslim friend, what does it mean for Jesus to have glory with the Father before the world existed? Remember when we were earlier, we were looking at John chapter 1. So before the creation of the world, Jesus is in perfect fellowship and harmony and relationship with the Father. What does that mean? Again, and here, if we look at the tense had, it's in the Greek, it's not an aorist, but rather it's an imperfect tense. In other words, that I was having with you before the world was, before the creation. I was having fellowship with you. I was sharing the glory with you. I was in perfect relationship with you. What does that mean? It means that Jesus must be in an eternal fellowship and relationship with the Father, and therefore, at least, I mean, I'm a Trinitarian, of course, but at least in this passage, we have a relationship that is existing between two persons. Now, I really hope that helps my Muslim friends out. I invite you to respond to the text and interact with the text. Again, I will not entertain basically questions on corruption or running off to another passage. I would be willing to look at that possibly later on, but what I'm trying to do is promote a honest and meaningful discussion between us without name calling. I'm going to try to be careful with even the Christians insulting any individuals. In fact, I think what I shall do is, if I do catch an insult, that I will just delete that comment because it's unnecessary. And so I want to have a good discussion between Muslims and Christians regarding what the Bible has to say about Jesus. And you may not believe the Bible. That's, I mean, it would be wonderful if you did. But what I want to do is promote a discussion where we begin to understand what does the Bible teach about who Jesus is. So again, I will not entertain questions that are about the corruption of scriptures or whatever. But as long as you deal with the text, and this text specifically, I'll try to get back to you I'll try to answer to the best of my ability. Anyways, I want to thank you all for watching. There's nobody looking at the moment, but possibly hopefully you'll catch this later. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. I don't know whether I'll be back anytime again today or not. I would like to get a few other things accomplished. And anyways, you all have a great day, and may the Lord open all our eyes so that we may have a greater understanding of who He is. Thanks for watching.